Good morning or afternoon, everyone. My name is Jackson Martin, and I am a senior at the University of Kansas. I study economics and Chinese language. Like Reina, I've been working under Dr. Zhang at the Trade War Lab for about a year now. And with Dr. Zhang's help, I developed a case study examining Chinese economic coercion of Australia in 2020 to 2021. So a brief introduction to the most recent trade conflict between Australia and China. In April 2020, the Australian Prime Minister echoed the calls from the United States to call for an international investigation into the origins of COVID-19. Following this, Beijing imposed sanctions on imports of Australian barley and banned beef imports from Australia's 4 largest producers. Specifically, they levied over an 80% import duty on Australian barley. Following this, in October 2020, China expanded the list of previous restrictions to include Australian coal, cotton, log timber, and lobster. The following month, the Chinese embassy in Australia leaked a list of grievances to the Australian media, which included Australian government policies that it was implied the Beijing would lift the restrictions if these policies were halted. They included, the main grievance was that Australia was being kind of a puppet for the US in calling for a COVID inquiry. Other policies included Australian government funding of, quote, anti-China research, and complaining about unfriendly reports about Australia in the Australian news media. So following this, Australia didn't give in to this coercion, and China subsequently imposed steeper duties on Australian wine, up to 200% in some cases, and expanded restrictions on beef imports before finally indefinitely suspending all high-level economic dialogue with Australia just 2 months ago. So the leaked list of grievances is really key here in understanding that this is really a case of pure economic coercion. China essentially has a list of demands for the Australian government, policies that it wants them to get rid of, and is demonstrated that it's willing to resort to economic sanctions to achieve those goals. So my main research question is to explore why China targeted certain Australian exports and not others. This is important because it can help us understand how China wields its economic influence in practice as it steps into its role as a rising great power. The value of the 9 Australian exports which were targeted by Chinese import restrictions is $30 billion in 2019 US dollars, which is just over a quarter of the total value of Australia's total exports to China. So I'm going to go about exploring this research question by looking at whether or not theories of interdependence and economic coercion hold at the sectoral level instead of the state level in the case of China and Australia. So this figure shows the makeup of Australia's exports to China in 2019. China is Australia's largest trading partner. And notably, we can see right off the bat that iron ore accounted for about 50% of Australia's total exports, and 2/3 of China's total iron ore imports came from Australia. And we should also note that iron ore was not one of the products targeted by Chinese trade restrictions. So a little bit of background, some of the thinking and theory that goes behind this. Professor Gartsky and Westerwinter found that at the state level, interdependence between states actually increase the risk of non-military conflict. And this essentially means that when one state in a dyad, in a bilateral relationship, is more dependent on trade with that state than is its partner, the less dependent state essentially has economic leverage and can use that leverage to coerce the more dependent state into adopting a certain policy or halting certain policies in this case. But in the real world, we also have to take into account the network effect, which is that when a state is coerced, they don't only have the option of demonstrating resolve by, withholding and taking the hit to their economy. They can opt to search for alternative export markets and establish new trading relationships. So I test this by measuring extradyadic dependence, which is the value of all trade in a certain sector minus trade with the trading partner over as a share of GDP. And so I test three hypotheses. First, that sectors with higher dyadic asymmetry, that is, sectors that are in which Australia is more dependent, much more dependent on China, were targeted more often by Chinese restrictions. Two, sectors in which Australia's extradyadic dependence is lower were targeted more often. And extradyadic dependence basically indicates the extent to which trade with partners other than China contributed to GDP, Australia's GDP. So the higher this value is, basically indicates that trade with China is relatively less important to Australia's economy than trade with its other partners, and vice versa for it being lower. And finally, whether we look at whether or not sectors which were included in the US-China Phase 1 trade deal were targeted more often by Chinese restrictions. So this is important and really the key takeaway of this case study. The US-China Phase 1 trade deal was signed in January 2020, and in it included agreements for China to increase purchases of US goods and services, specifically to increase purchases of US energy products by over $50 billion over 2 years, and increase purchases of US agricultural products by over $30 billion over 2 years. So basically we want to know, is China restricting imports of Australian goods so that it can better fulfill its purchase agreements with the United States? If indeed this is the case, this would be quite significant, because if China is using sanctions to substitute Australian products with US products, it may mean Australia is paying the price for the US trade war with China, which has possible implications for the alliance. So I used 2019 trade values for Australia and China, and this shows how these are the equations for how I calculated dependence as well as extradyadic dependence. And as we can see here, this figure is demonstrating the number of sectors at the HS2 level, which were included or not included in the Phase 1 deal that were targeted. And as we can see, there's only one sector not included that was not targeted by Chinese sanctions, which was copper. So all goods except for copper included in the Phase 1 trade deal, we can see were disproportionately targeted by Chinese trade restrictions, demonstrating that inclusion in the deal increased the likelihood of a good being sanctioned by China. And indeed, as we can see, there was over 2020, from January to December, there was a sharp decline in Chinese imports of Australian barley and coal following the imposition of duties. And these declines do appear to be correlated with increased imports, increased Chinese imports of US agricultural and energy products, respectively, in 2020, supporting the hypothesis and the notion that China was sort of sacrificing trade with Australia by way of sanctions in order to better meet its purchasing targets of US goods. So this figure is demonstrating, shows the average dyadic asymmetry. And again, basically the higher the average asymmetry, the greater the extent to which Australia is dependent on China for trade with China in that sector. So as we can see, the sectors which were targeted by China at the bottom have a much higher average asymmetry than goods in the same sector which were not targeted. So this is possibly an indication of coordination by China to target the goods in which Australia is heavily dependent on China. So this has implications. The implication of this is basically China could be attempting to maximize the harm to Australia while limiting to the extent to which is possible to its domestic interests. And as we can see, notably, the sector with the highest asymmetry that was not targeted, but when we exclude iron ore from the calculation, we see that Australia and China are much more interdependent in the mineral product sector. This figure shows the average extradyadic dependence of targeted and non-targeted goods. So higher extradyadic dependence for China essentially indicates that trade with Australia is less important relative to all of China's other trading partners. And so we don't really see a clear pattern here. Australia's average extradyadic dependence does not seem to be related to whether or not that sector was targeted by Chinese trade restriction. The conclusions and takeaways from this case study were that I found that interdependence was negatively related to the likelihood that a sector would be targeted. And both being included in the phase 1 deal and greater Australian dependence on China increased the likelihood of a sector being targeted. So this has, I think, interesting implications for the US-Australia relationship, in that if indeed Australia is being punished for the US-China trade war, how will that affect the ability of Australia and the US to cooperate moving forward? And future directions for this research, I think I can find, with more time, I think I can find a better measure for extradyadic relationships at the sector level, and also the qualities of the goods with high levels of asymmetry but were not targeted, specifically dyadic asymmetry that were not targeted, should be explored more in depth. And China's role in global trade of iron ore should also be explored more in depth. Thank you.
Thank you, Jackson. Excellent work. First comment, Admiral Thomas.
Yeah, Jackson, again, like the previous two presenters, this is absolutely quality work. I think Ben's comment in the chat, Jackson, you ought to take a look at that one, because I think that frames the issue perfectly based on what you taught me. I really liked, from a style perspective, that you laid out, like Colin did, and less so, Raina, this kind of linear approach to the timeline to set the context. And then you moved to 3 hypotheses and really kind of teased out this idea. I would call it almost precision guided use of the interdependence, kind of coercion, sanctions approach. And then you really brought that home with this iron ore issue not being targeted, as you made this relationship both in the bilateral and then kind of this triangulation that the PRC used with respect to Australia and kind of making it hurt where it counted. You know, it did kind of remind me of something that I talk about with my international relations students when they ask about Australia. I say, you know, if there's anything that jumps out about Australia in the US hub and spoke alliance system in Asia, it's that Australia has been too good of an ally for too long. And what I mean by that is if you look back over the last 100 years, the number of times the Australians have dutifully followed the Commonwealth or the United States on any series of misadventures that we can cook up, it's phenomenal that the Australians still hang in there with us. And absolutely, to your point, they pay a price in Asia for that loyalty. Let's just put it that way. I thought this was really, really a solid presentation, and I love Ben's comment because I think that gets to this future research, Jackson, that you may want to do.
Thank you, Admiral Thomas. Ben, you want to elaborate on your comments and maybe kick us off on the discussion? Is Ben still here?
Yeah, I mean, because I think we generally ignore the consumption side a little bit when we think about states imposing sanctions, right? Like, so we ignore the consumption side in the sanctions imposing state, right? Where, so we think about, okay, how does this state select commodities or select so goods and services that they're going to go after, right? Okay, we know Kim Jong, I think it was Kim Jong-il who really had a taste for foreign whiskey, and we're going to target that with sanctions or something, right? We're thinking about sort of our power to hurt the state we're sanctioning here, right? And that's to the extent that our field even has a coherent theory of why certain products are selected. It's generally a mix of what's going to hurt the other state most and where am I going to get the most pushback domestically, right? I'm going to avoid the things that are going to, where my domestic producers are well organized and politically influential. Okay. This takes that a step forward by actually, now we have a stylized fact from which to build a theory about when you actually have a portfolio of states against which you're implementing sanctions, right? When you're not just, it's not just dyadic here, but because China isn't just sanctioning Australia, they're also sanctioning the US and they're also sanctioning the Western Europeans, right? How do they choose kind of what to sanction where? And now you see this really clear, well, if I sanction everybody in this, you know, in this product category, my importer, you know, the consumers here are really that's what's going to intensify, you know, it's going to raise domestic prices and hurt me politically. So what I'm actually going to do is figure out wherever I'm going to be easing up in the US trade war, that's where then I feel like I have a free hand to go whack Australia. Right. And so it's not even so much going after where is Australia the most vulnerable, but what are my cheapest weapons? And my cheapest weapons are the ones where I'm just ramping up purchases from the US so I can afford to go over here and whack the Australians with that hammer. That's essentially, you've given us an empirical pattern that pretty much writes the theory already. And then there's this process of really thinking through what are the mechanisms behind this theory? How generalizable is it? Really like sort of putting the scope conditions around it, making some predictions from that theory that allow us to say, okay, this was the pattern we observed in this US, Australia, China situation. What would our predictions be out of that sample, right? So we took some facts, we induced a theory, we actually put the details around that theory, which is going to take a lot of work. And then you take that theory outside of the sample from which you built it, right, to novel data to make novel predictions. And then we, you know, if we succeed in that whole arc, we have a theory that helps us understand product selection and sanctioning, which I think is a worthwhile advance, right? So you've kind of done this, inductive, you know, good chunk of this inductive stage for us in the way you've laid that out. So yeah, this is the kind of thing that your doctoral dissertation could be about, kind of thing, right? So you've really opened up an interesting can of worms here.
Stuff, Ben. echo completely what you've said. One thing to put on everyone's table, right? We are in the process of completing the China and Russia ties data set, which hopefully will be the universe of sanctions these two countries have been involved in, and then we have reasonably good data, right, on U.S. stuff. So this research agenda is infinitely feasible, and also I think there's an important policy implication to tease out, right, which is this highlights sort of some of the pitfalls of managed trade if you do it poorly, right? Which is that if you try to intervene and at home, right, the phase 1 trade deal was sold as a pretty big success. A lot of folks got behind it, right? At the same time, you're trying to pursue a quad strategy and get Australia to coordinate on a bunch of security and economic stuff with China. If you don't have these two elements sort of coordinate with each other, you could end up with, at the very least, a poor policy that harms Australia. Over to Eric.
Yeah, I think this is terrific work and more than exceptional for an undergraduate. I think it's something I would expect to see at the PhD level. I'd probably push it a bit more to get more polished, but very impressive and emblematic of what Jack in particular, and I think the whole team has been striving for. So this is terrific. A couple of thoughts. One of the things that we end up doing a lot of times in scholarship is assuming what other people are trying to achieve and then saying they haven't gotten there. And we might be right, but it's possible that we're assuming the wrong things about their objectives. And especially in this kind of setting, there could be a variety of different goals. And we could go on and on about them, but just for illustration, one would be to try to get the other side to change their current policy. Well, much of the scholarship on this suggests that that doesn't work very well. And so scholars went ahead and started to think about other things that might be in the works, like putting them on notice that this is a consequence for behaving this way so they don't do it again, right? Deterring the future instead of compelling the present. Maybe that's it. Or it's making the local folks happy that you're doing something about something when you don't want to do what really works, because it's very expensive to go to war with everybody all the time, even though the US tries. So, and we could spin these out. And it turns out the time horizon story, again, plays a role here, because things that might work poorly in the short term might work just fine in the longer term if, in fact, there's a demonstration effect of imposing something. And you have to look at the nature of the tool. One of the things that there's this current move to talk about weaponizing stuff. And I just love to hate this stuff, because the kind of weapons we're talking about are like a gun that shoots both ways. Okay, you want to impose sanctions on somebody? Well, this is a gun that shoots both ways. Okay, yes, you can hurt them, but it hurts you too. And last year, there was this wonderful illustration of this. The Chinese imposed sanctions on the Canadians for a variety of things, and included pork. And then they realized, hey, we really like pork. This isn't working out well for us. So they stopped doing it. All right. They kept the other sanctions, but the pork went away. Okay. So here's a dilemma that anybody considering sanctions faces. If you pick something that hurts the other side a lot, but not very much you, then you have a lot of coercive leverage over them, which could change their behavior in the short term or the medium term or the long term, depending on that other story, okay? But it tells them almost nothing about what you value, because it's cheap and easy for you to do. It's very tempting for you to do it. Maybe, in fact, because you don't care very much and aren't willing to impose some other sanction that's more costly for you personally. Back in the 90s, the US imposed, or 80s or whenever it was, US imposed quotas on the importation of Japanese cars, but they limited it to $35,000 cars, which at the time, there weren't many Japanese cars that cost that much. So the only people that were grumbling were like kind of rich Americans that weren't buying American. And there weren't many voters in that category. Okay, so the things that hurt the other side more may be great in compelling them to change their behavior in the short or long term, but it doesn't tell us anything about your motivation for doing it. So it shouldn't resolve the presence of antagonism itself, right? The things that cost you a lot, that hurt you, to impose. You want these things. Like if the Chinese had kept that restriction on pork, that would have taught us something about the China that kept the restriction on pork was a different China than the one we observed. We would know that China really cares a lot about this issue. Wouldn't do much necessarily to stop the Canadians from doing what they're doing, but it would let the Canadians know that the Chinese care a lot about this, and potentially that would lead to a resolution of the difference, whatever the resolution was, more quickly. So one issue is how you fight and how long it takes to resolve the fight. And the other is what you get as a resolution. And one of the things that makes this so complicated is when you have a gun that shoots both ways, you have to consider both of these factors at the same time. Okay, thank you.
Well put, Eric. Are you still planning to write that book for Oxford University Press on interdependence, an update? That would be a nice cover image.
Well, I'm writing a draft of this gun that shoots both ways piece. One of the things John Lindsay has put me onto is the potential of taking a series of articles I've written, revising them, putting a cover on them, and calling it a book. I don't really like that in principle, but I'm finding that it's more efficient, and it could potentially get that interdependence book out in 3 years instead of 17 or something like that. So,
more comments or feedback from the floor for Jackson. All right.
just one thought. Whenever you do something like an exercise like this, what's really, really useful is to have, you hinted at this in your last slide, but I would build on it a little bit. So how should each side play this game? And depending upon who your audience is, you can emphasize Australia more, or China more, or possibly the US as a third party. One of the interesting things that's happening right now is it looks like the Chinese are playing the lion game. They're picking off what they think are the weak members of the herd rather than going after the US. They're so angry at the United States for trying to get a hold of that Huawei person that they impose sanctions on Canada, right? So it stinks to be the small member of the alliance right now because China's going to take it out on you. But, and here's the kind of psychological dimension, which I think nobody in our community understands very well, which would be super, super useful to study more, is these things can backfire even if they work, because they make somebody angry and they change their time horizon. One of the things, at least the rhetoric in Australia looks like, is whereas maybe in the past, Australia was eager to accommodate Chinese wishes within a certain domain, now they're really thinking about how do we diversify our economy away from China so they can't do this to us in the future. And that's kind of sort of the worst outcome China could have. And this is a generic problem. Whenever you use a weapon of coercion, you teach an adversary about a vulnerability that they may not have realized or may not have focused on as a vulnerability. And you encourage them to think about ways to get around that so that in the future, you don't have that leverage anymore. And that's a problem. You use it and you teach them and you lose it to some degree.
Jeff, let me jump in just to say, just so that lest Jackson think that the silence on this one, that was great. I thought it was a really fantastic presentation. And I think you did a really good job of telling a story. And I had some of the same questions or same ideas that Ben and Jack did. I study a lot about alliances, and it really made me think about sort of holding a coalition to not sort of fulfill the need that's now generated from the backwards recoil of the gun with the consumers in the country that is using the economic coercion. But I thought it was really compelling, a really interesting story. I think all three of you should really consider, if you're not already going and doing a PhD. I think you guys all, were really clear in how you stated a research question and the data, and I think you all have this really nice parallel structure with this descriptive temporal variation over time that illustrated the problem. I just thought all of you had really elegant presentations and really thought really scientifically. So I'm just super impressed.
Yeah, why would you want to inflict that misery on all these good folks? There are no jobs. Like Patrick's on the
right. You would be ironically, you would be studying economic opportunities, trade, coercion without any economic means yourself. So willing to sign up for that.
But Jackson will be graduating this year, and I think applying to graduate programs, I think looking at master's programs primarily. So I really think you should consider UCSD and GPS to work with Admiral Thomas and Eric and many of us who are Eric students who are still affiliated with the campus one way or another. So thank you all for all the comments.
Yeah, thank you for your feedback, especially Professor Gartsky. I really appreciate. I thought it was really interesting. You know, you kind of analogized last year or the conflict with Canada and the issue of pork, and you know, this idea about signaling what is valuable. And I think that sort of came through. I didn't really express this clearly enough, I don't think, in the presentation. But yeah, this idea that by not sanctioning iron ore, given that there is this really high level of asymmetry there, China kind of, inadvertently showed that, okay, you know, at least on the surface, they were doing this because Australia called for an inquiry into the origins of COVID. But in Australia, or China has to say, okay, yeah, we care about this, we're not going to tolerate this, but not to the extent that we're willing to, you know, restrict trade in iron ore.
Yeah, and then Ben's point about downstream, what that means for the coalitions within China, which, you know, you could do without, especially if you can have replacement stuff from the US. But without iron ore feeding the steel industry that's already kind of on its last legs, and manufacturing and shipbuilding and all those things, you would be in a bad shape in the short run. And also from the Canada example from last year, I think there's some analogies between the soybean sort of stuff. People think of the soybean trying to crack down on Canadian soybeans. I think there's some evidence around the same time that they're using that to replace sort of American soybeans. There was the switch, like Canadian soybeans made up a bigger portion when China was cracking down on soybean exports as part of the trade war. But then once the deal hit, that became an attractive kind of commodity to coerce Canada on the whole Huawei thing. So we should, I don't know if you want to commit to writing a dissertation on this, but we should write maybe a shorter like policy piece and get some of this data out, because I think it's like really cool finding on the phase 1 trade deal and the sort of the unintended consequences.
Latin American wheat production is basically a product of Carter's embargo of wheat to Russia in 1979, or global economy part of it. Indian cotton came from the difficulty in exporting cotton from the American South in the Civil War and so on and so on. If you're going to hurt somebody with an economic sanction, it makes some sense to find out if this is actually going to encourage somebody else to enter the market and have a long-term effect on your economy. So.
Hey, Jack, just a few comments, and I know that we're under a time crunch here, but you know, first of all, this conversation that yourself, Professor Gartsky, Ben, Neil have had with the students brings out this idea that it's kind of playing in the background with all three presentations with respect to economic interdependence and the idea of sanctions. And that's a temporal aspect. And this last presentation really brought that up front. You know, is there a difference as you make that calculation as a nation state and you're going to sanction some other country, or you get into one of these triangulation issues? Hey, is this a fast action sanction where they can't develop the workaround? Or is are these sanctions so slow acting that it allows a Ukraine or it allows Australia to find and mitigate because it's, you know, it literally is a slow acting reaction. So there's this temporal aspect in this kind of, as you put it, weaponizing these sanctions that probably should be teased out. Number two, this is directed at Colin because, you know, he's going to go off and do great things for the nation in uniform. But we have, in fact, I think he might still be here at UCSD working for Professor Gartsky, is an Air Force officer doing a PhD. And I think that's an incredible investment by the Air Force. Brilliant idea. And you have people like Neil and, you know, that are here that can tell you more about the national laboratories than, you know, I mean, literally he's grown up in it and he taught me a lot the other day. So Colin, don't count yourself out of the PhD sweepstakes as the other two, your other two colleagues may move on. You may be in that one too. And third is also for Colin, the last slide, you know, the Go Air Force, Sink Navy or whatever it is. I love this, you know, 70% of the globe is covered in water, 100% airspace. If you could send that to me or send it to Professor Gartsky and he'll forward it to me, because I want to use it as an opener for this maritime domain technology course that we're going to teach at GPS in the fall. That's probably going to be the opening slide. So thanks.
You got it, sir. Thank you.
All right. Thank you so much, Admiral Thomas, for doing this again the second year. I think this is our second and last funded year for the DECUR, right? But we should maybe have conversations about what to do with this kind of infrastructure once we're done here.